Okay, everybody, we are now recording. Thank you for being here to participate in our presentation tonight for proposed UDC changes related to the historic and design review process. My name is Corey Edwards. I'm a Deputy Historic Preservation Officer with the City of San Antonio's Office of Historic Preservation, and I administer our design review program, and that's also working with our Hcrc as well as permits and plan review. On the call, we have other OHP staff. Obviously, we have Shannon Miller, our Director and Historic Preservation Officer for the city. With me on the other side of my monitor is Lauren Sage. She's our management analyst and is helping me through the UDC process. You'll also, if you go through the participants list, you'll see a few familiar faces with our design review program. Stephanie Phillips, I see Katie Totman, and Jessica Anderson. They are all our historic preservation specialists that help with the program. And so if you can think back to 18 months ago, we had a very similar presentation to this one in March of 2019 before the world ended. And it was really gearing up at that time for the UDC update cycle for the year. So we had been working previously with the task force to develop and recommend amendments that were potentially going to go through that process. And we had just started kind of our public input phase when that happened. So I think, as everybody knows, the process has been on pause since that time. And we're at a point now we are ready to kind of restart that discussion. And so this is really intended to be a refresher of what was proposed and discussed at that time. Our goal is really to get as much input as possible as we prepare amendments. Ideally, whatever we produce from this office is going to be reflective already of sort of the community goals and feedback that we're getting from you all. And so that's why we wanted to have these early meetings to kind of make sure that everyone's aware of the process that went into developing potential recommendations, as well as being familiar with the process for participating and providing comments related to those changes. Okay, so quickly overview of what we're going to talk about tonight. And, we scheduled 90 minutes. I think we're going to use every bit of that time. This is a lot of information. I think most people on this call have utilized the WebEx platform before. This is what the city usually uses for its meetings. Feel free at any time in the bottom panel of the screen, you'll see the chat feature. I've already dropped a chat in there so that you can see. If at any point you have a question about something you see or a comment, feel free to put it in the chat. My team's going to be looking at those. If it's something that we can answer right away, yeah, Lauren just dropped something in there now, so you should get a little notice. If it's something we can answer right away, then we will. If it's something that can wait until later in the presentation, then we'll wait, we'll hold it. And then obviously at the end, if you have any questions, we'll probably just have some open discussion time. It looks like we have about 28 to 30 participants, so that's really a good size for just having open discussion, I think, in this format. But at any moment, don't hesitate just to drop a chat. So a little bit of what we're going to be talking about tonight about the role of the Office of Historic Preservation, how we administer our programs. What are some of the issues that we've identified over the past several years of administering the program that we're trying to resolve through potential UDC amendments? Background on how we developed the recommendations that you'll be hearing tonight, and then what are the actual proposed changes or improvements to each kind of area. If you've attended any presentations given by me in the past couple of years, you've seen a very similar chart. This was most recently updated in October, which was the beginning of our new fiscal year. And so this is all of our design review trends over the past several years. Coincidentally, I joined the Office of Historic Preservation in fiscal year 12, which is kind of when we started tracking these things, because I'm the one who tracks them. And you can see that our caseload has risen pretty steadily over this time. This chart is broken into three categories: the administrative certificates of appropriateness issued as a result of an Hcrc case, as well as demolition reviews. And so we review all demolition permits and make a decision and action on those. And so when you can combine all of these reviews, the total number of applications has pretty consistently gone up over time. It's more than doubled actually since fiscal year 11. With a similar level of staffing, to be honest. We have actually added staff twice in the span of this chart. We added one position in fiscal year 18, and we did it again at the end of fiscal year 21. It's actually a new position posted for this next upcoming year. So we're hoping to be a little more adequately staffed to address these, but it's still not quite enough. And if we anticipate that this trend is going to continue, we need to make sure that our process and policies in place are robust and give us the tools we need to address this caseload. So we're going to call these challenges. Our caseload and turnaround time is a challenge. We're doing our best as our policy to receive or to hear each application with the same timeline that we normally would, regardless of our caseload. And so if we need to work a little harder to make sure that we're turning cases around, then we do that. We have had at least one instance where we had to cap agendas briefly for a couple months during quarantine or early stages of the pandemic when we weren't meeting as much. The reason we can't cap routinely is because the caseload has never really gone down over time, as you can see. And so we would just be delaying action on really all of the items because they would just build up and build up. The administrative functions also are ongoing. So, with Hcrc cases, there's posting requirements, there's file creation, a lot of really kind of time-consuming work with the administration of the program. We want to maintain a good level of customer support. That means we're performing site visits, we're meeting with customers, we're doing preliminary consultations for somebody submitting an application, and doing as much as we can to provide support in the process, and that takes time as well. And it's not just us. So we are the paid professionals, we're staff who are administering the program, but we also have volunteer commissioners. At least one who is on the call, Monica Savino, is our District 2 representative. And they're volunteering their time to serve on the Hcrc and also serve to attend the design review committee meetings. So, in any given month, there's potentially 4 to 6 meetings that these volunteers are each attending and providing their recommendations on cases. And so we want to be aware of that time commitment and sensitive to it as we address our caseload. And then there's also a perception, and we get this feedback quite often, of inconsistent outcomes. And so that is a goal of ours, is to make sure that cases do have consistent outcomes so that there's predictability in the process. Very often somebody will point to a property down the street that is similar to theirs that had a similar case with a different outcome. And not to say that all cases shouldn't be treated differently, because they are, but generally we want to make sure that that perception is eliminated by making sure we have a thorough and consistent process that we can point to. So on the other side, we have opportunities. So kind of what I spoke to earlier, predictable and consistent outcomes is a huge goal of ours. We want anybody submitting an application to know exactly what to expect and what their review looks like and what a likely outcome would be. We also want to make sure we preserve accessibility to our process, that it's clear and easy to understand, easy to use. We don't want anybody to be intimidated by approaching the Hcrc or approaching OHP staff with a request. We think it's important that you all, you're our customers as well. You mostly live in historic districts, that you trust the process, you trust staff to administer it, and also know and are familiar with how to participate in the process. It is a public process, and so we want everyone to be engaged and to understand how they can participate. And we also want to make sure we're utilizing technology to our advantage. So since this presentation was last given in March of 2019, we've actually made a lot of advancements in how we receive and also make applications available to the public. If you attended our trainings earlier this year through the Historic Districts Coalition, there were a few presentations on how to use our new Explorer map accessible on our website, how to view incoming cases, as well as recently issued approvals. And so we're only building from that technology that's available to us now. So when looking at the UDC, so the Unified Development Code, the type of things we're looking at are application and review types and requirements. The code is going to identify and identify the different types of reviews that are in place with the program. Its certificates of appropriateness, its demolition permit reviews, and what are the requirements for each of those type of application types. It's going to give the steps of the process, and that includes how long a application is reviewed for, how long is it open, what are the potential outcomes of a review, who does what are the roles, et cetera, et cetera. It's going to tell staff how to review an application or how to review a request. So it's going to give us the applicable standards, guidelines, or criteria under which we review a project and apply them. It's going to tell us who makes decisions and how long that person has to make a decision, as well as what happens following a decision. So can it be appealed? Can it not be appealed? Can somebody come back to the Hcrc with a revised request? All of that lives in the development code. Now, when we talk about the greater goals of the program, there's also policy considerations. And so there's a lot of kind of efficiencies that we can do at the staff level just administratively to make sure the process is running smoothly and effectively. So sometimes we tinker with how the agenda comes together, the order and groupings of things so that we can be kind of more streamlined in the actual meetings. Review turnaround times. And so developing internal policy and our standard operating procedures of how long we take with something before a decision can be made or before it's escalated. That's all kind of internal. Of course, we do have informational materials and outreach that we have available on our website and in print, and events like the Historic Homeowner Fair to make tools available to anybody who's going to be going through the process. We have our preliminary agendas and courtesy notices. If you sign up to Constant Contact Alerts, you get emails from us all the time. Website, social media, all of those things are kind of our policy for how we administer the program. And so as we're looking at being effective and as we're looking for optimizing results, these are things that we look at in addition to what the actual development code says. So in looking at updates to the UDC, we have a few goals, and this is really kind of a summary, but really we want to protect our process. We want to make sure that it's fair for anyone participating. And we also want to make sure it's defensible. As decisions are made and as there's outcomes, we want to be able to point to a process that was clear and effective and documented, and that makes the decision-making more defensible in the long run. We want to make sure that whatever policy is adopted and administered by our staff is reflective of our neighborhoods and our community values as a whole. And so we're listening to people, we're making sure that the process is working for the people that participate in the process. We want to make sure that we are not sticking our heads in the sand and we're responding appropriately to changes in development trends. The types of things that people are building is different today than it was 10 years ago. And so making sure that we have the right tools to adequately address those types of requests. And then always we're looking for ways to innovate the process, improving efficiency and effectiveness of our program. I was asked at some point in the process of developing UDC amendments if staff was trying to make the process more difficult or easier to navigate, or if we were trying to make it harder for something to be approved, or we were trying to make it easier. And it's not really about making the approval harder or easier to get. What we're trying to do here and what our goal is to make sure the process is easier to navigate and harder to challenge, so more defensible and more clear as what to expect in the process. So I already said this briefly, but we did begin meeting with a UDC task force as early as the summer of 2019. And this was really kind of a group that we pulled together to help inform the process from start to finish, in addition to how we're engaging the public and how we're maintaining a website with information, and making sure that anything that we're developing is reflective of sort of those community values that we talked about. On the task force, we had a really wide range of participants, from neighborhood representatives, association leaders, architectural review committee leaders from neighborhood associations, land use attorneys, members of the real estate council, design professionals, architects, members from advocacy groups, as well as city council staff. And so it was really a good kind of meeting of the minds to talk through these issues that we're all experiencing with the design review process. If you want a full list of the membership, that is on our website, and I'll show you how to get there at the end. Many of you are on the call, actually, and so I actually might go down the list and point out who from our task force is here. I see we're already about 20 minutes in, so let's save that. So the task force really identified 4 major areas where we were going to focus our attention: the landmark designation process, the Hcrc rules of procedure and kind of the makeup of the Hcrc, changes to the certificate of appropriateness review process, and there's a few kind of subcomponents there. And number 4 is neighborhood infill, mostly in regards to multifamily. I would say small to medium scale multifamily, which is mostly what we're seeing in terms of trends in new construction. And there's a few historic districts in particular where we're seeing this most prevalently. So first, let's dig into the landmark designation process. For each of these, we'll kind of have a stopping point. If you have any questions about the section we're on, make sure to drop it in the chat. And I think we'll try to answer any questions related to that section once we get through those slides. So our goals here and some of the issues related to landmark designation is there's necessary changes that need to be made in our local development code to align our process with state legislation. There were changes at the two most recent state legislative sessions that I'll talk about. And then we're also going to talk specifically about the process by which a third party that's not the property owner, that's not the city, can ask a question about landmark designation for a property that's not currently designated. And we want to do what we can in our local code to make sure that that process is accessible, equitable, efficient, and defensible, all with the hopes of preserving that process. Because as you can see at the most recent two state legislative sessions, our ability to designate properties has been whittled down quite a bit. And we're a little bit afraid if we can't find a process locally that works in terms of a third-party application, then it could go away completely. And so we've really worked within the task force to develop some solid recommendations that we'll talk about. So starting in 2019, there was new legislation that introduced rules for designation without owner consent. And so just as a reminder, landmark designation, historic designation is a zoning overlay. And so we're really talking about the ability of a municipality to rezone a property without owner consent. So there's already provisions in the state local government code for that. And so this is a little more specific in terms or related to the landmark designation process. With the new rule in 2019, it requires a 3/4 vote at the relevant local commissions. And that legislation specifically said historic or zoning commission, understanding that not all cities are built the same. In many cases, the zoning / planning / urban design / historic preservation commission is all the same thing. Here we have it separated. And so that was our interpretation, is that it would be one or the other where that 3/4 vote would be required. Because right now our process would require a landmark case to go to both of those commissions. The other really big change is that religious owned properties cannot move forward without consent from the owner. And religious owned is defined through the tax code. And so that's a pretty broad term. And then there were a few additional notification requirements under the state law that we were actually already capturing in our local process, but we'll need to codify those as well. So then again, in 2021, the same authors came back with clarifications to that previous legislation that now says the city must designate the commission with its exclusive approval authority. And so what they did is they took away the or that you see here. And they really said that it's not either or, that the city must upfront designate which commission is going to be the deciding authority with a 3/4 vote. And so we've already made the determination that here in San Antonio, it's going to be the Historic and Design Review Commission. We have direction from council to do that. And then the other issue is that all of these rules that you see on this slide have now been extended to apply to historic districts. And what that really means is that a historic district, because it is a large area rezoning and there are going to be property owners that do not consent to the rezoning, that it's going to follow the same process. So the 3/4 vote is required at the historic commission level once the application for historic district designation has met the required threshold to move forward in the process. And so that includes religious owned properties as well. And so if there's a proposed historic district that includes religious owned properties, they can essentially now opt out of the proposed district designation, and you might even end up with a district with little holes in it as a result. So we did disagree, obviously, with the legislation. Unfortunately, it did move forward, and so we have no choice but to make sure that our local program aligns with that direction. So as a result, this is kind of a summary of those things. Anyone can still request a review of historic significance. So what we've really done since this time is clarify the process that there's really two questions being asked when a property is coming forward for landmark designation. The first question is whether or not it's eligible for designation. And the second question is, will it be rezoned? So because owner consent under the local government code is required to rezone a property, or that city council can move forward in the process without owner consent, and making sure that the 3/4 vote is obtained at the Hcrc level. The item does not move forward in the rezoning process if the 3/4 vote at the Hcrc level fails at any point in the process, so either at city council or with the Hcrc. And so that's really important to remember, especially when considering what it looks like for a third party to initiate the designation process, and we'll get there. So this is just another way to look at that. Typically, if an owner-initiated landmark designation is really just like an owner-initiated change in zoning request, only with the added step of the Hcrc first concurring with the finding of historic significance, essentially saying that it's eligible for designation. Without owner consent, that first step is going to happen no matter what. There's always going to be a determination about the eligibility. The only difference is it doesn't move forward to zoning unless city council initiates the designation case through a resolution. So in those cases, when there is a property that comes forward either by request of city staff or through a third party, the first step is always going to be the eligibility determination at Hcrc. And if that's approved by a simple majority, it goes to city council for a resolution. If that fails, there's nothing else, there's no next step in the case, and the item doesn't move forward. If city council does approve a resolution, and very often they do, because it's really viewed as sort of the start of the public input process for the designation case, then it would come back to Hcrc, where we would seek a supermajority vote in order to meet the state requirement. If that happens, then it moves forward through the zoning process just like a normal zoning case, with the exception that it would again require a city council supermajority vote. So that is all consistent with state law and the local government code, but it still raises questions. And the question we hear most often is, so anyone can just apply to have my property designated? And the answer is no, really. What anybody can apply to do is have an initial hearing regarding the eligibility. And so that doesn't necessarily kick off the rezoning process. All it does is prompt a city public hearing regarding the eligibility of the site. From there, well, just to repeat here, so a third party may submit a request for review for determination regarding the eligibility of the property. And that consideration is really just a review under the criteria that DEC provides for historic designation. From there, again, if city council approves a resolution, then it can move forward in the actual rezoning process, in which case we'll be making sure that the voting requirements under state law are met at each step in the way. So within the task force, we convened a subcommittee that was working on this very issue. The questions we asked is for these third-party requests. And so somebody that's not the property owner, usually it's a neighborhood association or concerned citizens with a proposed demolition that are submitting these applications. Many of you also, I know, receive the demolition alert emails, and so you might get those, see that there's an incoming demolition. You might be concerned about it, indicate your concerns to staff, but some of you also might submit an application, which is the request for review of historic significance. So the question is, should there be a threshold of some sort for that? Should it be easy or hard for somebody to initiate a public hearing regarding the eligibility of a property? Should there be a fee? Should there be some documentation requirements? And then while we were also meeting within the task force level, we also maintain a network with other city preservation offices. So all of the largest cities in the US, so Los Angeles, New York, et cetera. We all have our own kind of policies for how we work through these issues, and there were some best practices that we followed as well. And so where we landed and the recommendations from that subcommittee are updating the application requirements for a non-owner request for review of historic significance to include a petition with the names, addresses, and signatures of about 30 individuals. And that is not households, that is individuals. And so if there's multiple people in a household, then there's multiple names on the petition. It requires the notification of the Registered Neighborhood Association and its council office that the application is being submitted. And you have to actually complete the application with research and documentation and a statement of significance. You have to tell us why it's eligible and how it meets the eligibility criteria outlined in DEC. We do not believe there should be a fee for this initial process. But as you know, we are already reviewing all demolition requests for eligibility under the UDC. And our staff is trained and qualified to do that. And so there might be a situation where a demolition application has come in. We've done a community notice so that everyone knows it's happening. And we've done our review, and at the end of our eligibility review, we found that it doesn't meet the threshold for designation and isn't moving forward for an eligibility determination. Sometimes you all disagree. There might be a association or a member of the public that does think it's eligible and does think that it meets the criteria. And so if there is, so in those instances, we would sort of treat it like an appeal. You would be appealing staff's determination to the Hcrc. If that happens, we believe there should be a small application fee. This is in line with an existing process that we have for designation verification, our historic assessment process. And so essentially it is appealing staff's determination to the Hcrc. It requires you to tell us what we missed in our research, and as well as provide additional evidence that was not previously considered in our review. We have a question from Ezekiel, majority versus supermajority. So that is a UDC thing. The voting requirements and quorum requirements for most cases at the Hcrc, which are a action regarding a certificate of appropriateness, a simple majority of those present is required. So if we have 6 commissioners present, then only 4 of them have to vote on it to approve something with a majority. The supermajority requirement is actually of all members. So it's not even those members that are present. We have 11 members total. And so that means that we always need a vote of 9 in order to pass one of these designation cases to meet the state code. So the 3/4 vote that is required under state law is a vote of 9. That was a good question, thank you. That brings us to the end of this section. And again, this concept has been out there for a while. I know a lot of you have kind of been thinking about it over the past several months. I'm not seeing any questions come in the chat, so I will keep going. I should have said also earlier, the task force, we have not met with them since last year. We wanted to have this initial meeting first to make sure we're capturing kind of community comments. We're going to take those all back to the task force this week. And so any comments that you have today or the next following couple of days, please make sure you provide them to us so that we can share those with our task force. Okay, moving on to recommendations to the Hcrc rules of procedure. All of this is really aimed at decreasing the number of cases that are reviewed on each Hcrc agenda and really being sensitive to the time commitment of our volunteer commissioners. So the summary of the recommendations from that subcommittee are to increase the membership, and I'll explain what we're proposing in the next slide. Establish a new compliance and technical advisory board called a Ctab for short, and then make sure our quorum requirements are updated consistent with the state laws that we just discussed. So just to recap, if you're not familiar with the Historic and Design Review Commission, it is a recommending body to city staff. They meet twice per month formally with public hearings, as well as meeting at the subcommittee level in between those meetings. So again, it's somewhere between 4 to 6 meetings a month that they can attend and help us review cases with. The Hcrc is design focused. We're reviewing new construction, additions, and alterations to historic properties, site elements and signage, as well as recommendations for landmark designation. What is proposed with the Ctab is basically a double in the membership. So right now there's 11 members, that's 10 council districts plus the mayor, each appointing a member. We would now ask each person to appoint 2 members to the Hcrc so that the new members can make up the Ctab and also serve as alternates to the full commission. We don't even have alternates right now, and that would be a code change to allow for that. So with alternates, as we have absences or scheduling issues with full-time commissioners, the new members for the Ctab would be able to fill in their shoes at the regular Hcrc hearings. The Ctab would meet just once per month, and they would take cases that were compliance and technical in nature. So we are looking at cases where work was done without approval or beyond scope, and sometimes those are tricky and require a great deal of discourse at the public hearing to resolve. We are also envisioning this board as being more materials and conditions and technical focused. And so what are appropriate replacement materials? This includes replacement of windows, which show up a lot on the Hcrc agendas, which is the next slide actually. What is an appropriate roofing material specification, porching specifications? All of those kind of nitty-gritty details would be to this board. And really we got here just by going through a quick exercise of seeing how often things like window replacement and siding replacement of original historic materials were landing on an agenda. And pretty consistently in a 1 month time frame, this was a year ago, but I looked at it recently too, and it's a similar number. We can easily find 10 cases that would now land on this new Ctab agenda. So that's kind of the thinking, is that now that 10 cases that would normally be on a full Hcrc hearing would now go to this new board for a more focused conversation. So the subcommittees would be updated accordingly as well. And so we actually would like to mix it up a little to where all members are serving on both committees. The design review committee would now potentially meet 4 times a month pretty consistently to review incoming new construction, any sort of complicated or high profile requests that would be going to the Hcrc, as well as cases referred to the committee at the regular public hearing by the full Hcrc. These are both subcommittee structures that we have now. We would just be defining the membership a little better so that we would have more consistent participation. The Demolitions and Designations Committee meets now just kind of as needed, but now they would more consistently meet at least 1 time a month, mostly doing site visits to review incoming designation requests or potential designations that are prompted by a demolition permit application that's been submitted. So this subcommittee structure would be incorporated into the UDC. And we've also talked about clarification of what happens at the committee. No action is taken. We want to preserve the informal nature of these meetings. And so it's really just about preparing the applicant through discussion, making sure that if there's outstanding questions that the applicant can answer them or is prepared to answer them with the full commission, and providing some early comments, but not taking action on cases. And again, I think I said this already, but updating the quorum requirements that are outlined in the UDC to make sure we're reflecting current state law. We have a couple of questions. Who can overturn an Hcrc decision? Well, really, so it depends on the type of request. Certificate of appropriateness requests are a recommendation to city staff. And so city staff issues the COA. It's usually consistent with the Hcrc recommendations. Those decisions can be appealed then by anybody who meets the requirements under the UDC for appeals. And that is also consistent with state law. There's kind of guiding state law with who can submit an appeal to a process. And the rules are it has to be somebody who is either a neighbor, so adjacent property owner, or somebody within 200-foot buffer of the property related to the decision that was made. And so anybody can appeal a decision as long as they're within that 200-foot buffer or is a neighbor. For designation decisions, it's different. There is actually a determination that's been in place for a number of years now, I guess probably 7 years ago, that really distinguishes the designation process as separate from the COA process. And so it's not a decision by staff, especially when looking at compliance with the state law. It's really about whether or not the voting requirement was met. And so in the same way that a zoning decision can't be appealed, a designation case can't be appealed. So I think, so it's kind of a two-pronged question as far as who can overturn an Hcrc decision. But really for a recommendation on a certificate of appropriateness, it's a neighboring property owner. Ricky asked, would the Ctab members have special skills? So we actually haven't defined kind of the different I guess qualification requirements or areas of expertise that would be required. But I do think we would, we're making the assumption now that it would be people that do have experience in dealing with historic buildings or historic properties. So that is something that could be further defined in the code potentially, but ultimately, those members are appointed by City Council, and so we're really looking for our City Council members to make those recommendations. But we will certainly provide that guidance. Another question about the Ctab composition: has there been any discussion to representation by historic district? Some council districts have a larger number of historic districts and landmarks than others. That is something that was discussed, but where we landed is that it is cleanest and more balanced for each council member just to appoint 2 appointees where they're doing it now. But Bianca, yes, that is something that came up kind of earlier on in the process. And I don't know that it's off the table completely, but it is. Obviously, the council members like to have representation at all of the boards and commissions. I think we'll continue to discuss that one. Okay, moving on. My screen's frozen. Okay, the next bucket is the COA review process. So some of the things, so this is a summary of changes from the recommendations of the task force, is updating the application requirements and completeness review requirements. And I'll explain why and how in the next few slides. Provide some much needed clarity, in my opinion, to the conceptual review process and eliminate ambiguous final approval language that currently exists. And we'll go into detail about that. Expand administrative approvals and adopt changes to the decision period for those administrative approvals, and then expand public access to items under review. I put the dates on there. This is something that we've actually done since the initial meeting in 2019. This is that Explorer map that we talked about. It's all using technology to make sure that we're more quickly streamlining information to the public. And if there's time at the end, I can do a quick demo of what that looks like. And then let me also add to this third bullet, with administrative approvals, we're also adopting or proposing new policy guides to inform the decision making so that there's a little more clarity about what to expect. A lot of people, well, let's talk about administrative approvals first. But before we do, conceptual review, this is a biggie. So conceptual review is in place because it provides a process for schematic level design to be considered. We believe this is very important because it's important to get as much early feedback in the process as possible. I think it's really important that people do have access to early feedback because it's going to optimize their success in the process. Very often, the expectation is that new construction cases are going through the conceptual review process prior to design development. That is not a requirement. It's just something that people know to do because it is an important step. And really with the idea that it's saving time and money in the long run. What's difficult is there's not really a defined application nor required application materials to do that. And I'll explain why. But because of that, it's not a decision on a COA like I talked about. So therefore it cannot be appealed. And so no decision is being made, it's non-binding, but you do get feedback from the full Hcrc through a vote of the Hcrc regarding your conceptual request. And then also just as background, and this is important to understand, that OHP staff, even though you don't see it at the public hearings, in the background here at our desks, we're doing plan review for all related construction permit sets for any historic property. And so that includes things that received administrative approval, that includes things that went to the Hcrc, that includes things that went to neither yet and just got flagged in a permit review. And so we're dealing with those. And so just know that our trained staff is looking at plan reviews all the time. And that's important to understand when we get into some of the changes. Some of the challenges with conceptual review, it's not well defined in the UDC. There's really just a couple kind of lines that describe it. And because of that, there is ambiguity in the process, and that's not something we like. We like for the process to be very clear and defined. It is non-binding, and so if the Hcrc approves your conceptual request, that doesn't mean they're bound to giving final approval for a permit set, which can lead to confusion. A lot of people get conceptual approval with stipulations and think that they've got their golden ticket and kind of move forward with plans only to find, oh, I'm going to get a different outcome in 8 months when I come back to the full hearing. And so that's something that we're very sensitive to as well. It also, depending on the amount of changes that happen between schematic and final review, you might end up going to Hcrc twice for the same thing. And so I'll explain how that happens and when with a few examples. And then again, kind of like I said, it could potentially result in conflicting results at an Hcrc hearing. You might be approved for conceptual and denied for final, and that is an issue. I mean, obviously, if something is denied for the right reasons, then the decision is defensible. That's fine. But we want to make sure, again, with our goal of having predictability and clarity in the process, we don't want somebody to be completely shocked when that happens. Like if they have conceptual review, that should be a good kind of indicator of what to expect in final review. So again, just restating, we believe that early feedback is critical to the process. We always like to say that it's important to get feedback before you are too financially and emotionally invested in a design. Usually the financial investment speaks more. So it costs a lot of money to do design development. So we want to make sure that, as that happens, that they're moving in the right direction and hopefully get a positive outcome, provided that they're meeting all of the feedback requirements from the Hcrc. And then sort of lowering the threshold to get access to the commission is also important. So that's what it does, is it allows you to ask a question and get important feedback at a lower threshold than coming in for a certificate of appropriateness request. And the reason for that now is that the code requires that a COA has 80% working drawings, and this is actual language that's in the UDC. And what it's intended to capture is that you've done basically almost full design development, or at least development of your architectural set. In design development, you're going to also get civil drawings and mechanical drawings and things that aren't always something that the Hcrc needs to see, and that all costs money to develop. And so we're instead trying to focus on making sure that the application materials are specific to the things that the commission requires in order to take action. And so instead of trying to define conceptual review, we're actually going to focus on better defining the COA application requirements in the code. And basically anything that comes forward that doesn't meet those application requirements can only be considered for conceptual review and will not receive a COA. So a little more about this language. It is poorly defined in my opinion, and we've heard from a lot of people as well that it does seem a little arbitrary. And again, with the issue, much of what happens during design development does not fall within the purview of the Hcrc. This includes interior layouts, like electrical, like all of those things that aren't really considered at the public hearing. Instead, we need to reinforce the requirements to provide measured exterior elevation, site plan, material specifications, all those things that are needed to make an informed recommendation at the commission level. And so this is actually a little snippet of the proposed language for the completeness review, is that when we get an application and we do our completeness check, we're going to make sure that it's including all of these things. If it doesn't, we're going to make a determination and we're going to say it's incomplete. And if you want to go forward to the commission, then they can only consider it for conceptual review. That is also a decision that the Hcrc can make. If something gets to them that passed our completeness, but they get it and feel that it does not meet the application requirements, then they can also take action to provide conceptual comments only and not issue a COA. So this is an example. This is actually one that came in for conceptual. And so this is an example of a schematic level design that didn't change greatly between this and the permit set. But as you can see, we have pretty much everything we need here to do the review. So we've got an annotated elevation, we've got the materials, it's to scale, we know how tall it is,
all of those things, so that when we review a permit set, we can review for consistency with what the Hcrc saw. This is an example of sort of that redundant hearing issue that we talked about. So the top is what came in for schematic level, and what the bottom is actually what was in the permit set, what came in for a final COA. And so there really wasn't much change here. And so the thinking that is, in these instances, where the schematic level or early architectural set includes enough information to do the review for a COA, then they can just go ahead and submit. We're not going to require that full design development to include all of those other things has been done at that time. This is an example of something that looks to scale, looks like it's ready for final approval, but would be found to be incomplete because it doesn't include dimensions everywhere in the elevations. And so if something was found to exclude the requirements for the application, then it would not go forward for COA. It could go forward for conceptual if that's what the applicant agreed to. Otherwise, it would be marked as incomplete, and we would wait to have those documentation drawings updated before moving forward. And then also explaining what would happen if something did get final approval. So you see the top drawing here versus what came in for permit review. And so you can see sometimes there'll be changes that happens between what the Hcrc saw and then what staff is seeing on the back end during the plan review. And so in this example, you see a few kind of changes to the fenestration pattern and types of windows. This is the type of thing that would require a new review by the Hcrc. And so in these cases, we send it back to the Hcrc for another recommendation for final COA so that we can take the appropriate action for the permit. Any questions about that? Conceptual review, plan review, a request for final approval? Keep thinking, and we'll go ahead and move on and talk about administrative approval. And so I don't really have a slide, but you can actually, if you think back to the graph that I showed at the very beginning, we broke down Hcrc COAs from administrative approval COAs. And you can see we're for the vast majority, mostly doing admin COAs on a daily basis. About 2/3 of all COAs are approved at the staff level, and then the rest go to the Hcrc. And the Hcrc is still getting a pretty full caseload at their hearings. And so we're looking at a few things when looking at that administrative approval process. We're looking to clarify and reinforce the application requirements to make sure that things that are coming to us are ready to review and have an action taken. We're going to reinforce our online portal process. And again, if there's time at the end, I'll explain more about that. The big one here is expanding the administrative approval list, and we'll go into detail about that. Adopting new policy documents to guide decision-making for administrative approvals, and then expand public access to items under review. And again, that one has already happened. So for your context, administrative approval is really just a decision at the staff level that doesn't require the public notice and public meeting requirements that a full Hcrc case would. So it's still going to have the same completeness review. We're still going to review it for consistency with whatever adopted standards or guidelines we have in place. For the most part, it's going to be our historic design guidelines, but there's other things in the UDC that we consider as well. We will always work with our applicants to address potential stipulations or things to make it compliant with those rules so that we can issue an approval. And then all of that could potentially be done pretty quickly. If we have everything we need, then we're going to do it right then. And that whole process from start to finish takes about 30 minutes. We do get quite a few per day and even more a week. And we try to get them to the right case manager who's most familiar with that area or with the property. And so turnaround time is really kind of a business day or two, depending on when the application comes in. With our new online portal, I think most of you know you can submit an application any time of day or night. So sometimes they're waiting on us in the morning. And so it might take a business day before we can get through that full list of things that came in. With the Hcrc case, there's just more that goes into it. So the red things are kind of more administrative duties that happen with an Hcrc case. And so same completeness review. It's really the same type of request under the code. Both of them are requests for a COA. And so the requirements are the same. But there's certain things that are eligible in the code for administrative approval, and the rest is not. And so the rest goes to the Hcrc. So a little bit behind the curtain, we assign it to an internal tracking sheet. We have meetings and we review those for completeness together. When we assign case managers, we draft the preliminary agenda, which many of you received. We do site visits. We draft the staff report recommendations, which takes quite a bit of time to put together. Sometimes there's the subcommittee meetings and sometimes additional site visits as needed. We're creating and publishing the files associated with that item. And we're meeting the public notice requirements, which is usually creating the yard sign and placing it on the property. And all of that is done without any extra staff. So it's the same people doing all of these things, and it just takes longer. So it's about, with the management at a minimum, it really takes about 2 hours per request. New construction cases take more. Those take sometimes 6 hours at least of review and administrative time. And more contentious cases can really go on into the 20s and 30s of hours of staff time, of individual case manager staff time to manage those items. So with the recommendations that we're about to go through, we believe we could reduce the Hcrc agenda cases by about 20%. We also think that it would encourage people to comply with the guidelines. If there's a chance that they could avoid a public hearing that is kind of scary and unknown and get a staff approval with something that is known and compliant with the guidelines, and we think that they're more likely to do that. And so again, we would hope to get more consistent and potentially standardized approvals through this process. And then if there's anything that is inconsistent with the guidelines or there's concern about, there's always a path to the Hcrc. The code doesn't bind us to approve anything at the staff level. It just gives us the option to. And so, some of you were involved in this. In 2009, we did a strategic historic preservation plan. And one of the recommendations was expanding the administrative approval list. Prior to this, it was really called, it was repair and maintenance only, and we called them short forms. And it was truly just, if you were replacing materials like for like or painting or doing something that didn't really change anything, then that was sort of the administrative approval option. So following these recommendations, there were UDC updates that were done with public input to expand that administrative approvals list. And what was done was look at the things that were landing on Hcrc agendas that were routinely approved or routinely approved with a certain stipulation, with little discussion that everyone was comfortable with. And so that grew into the initial administrative approval list that is in the UDC. And that includes things like, some replacement of materials with certain other things, provisions for hardscaping and backyards and building sheds and backyards and small additions, things that are technically changes but are minor in nature and not of great concern. So we did the same process. We looked at agendas, we looked at what was being routinely approved or what type of stipulations were routinely upheld at the Hcrc. And we are proposing to expand the administrative approval list again based on those trends. So we're really looking at any rear addition that is consistent with the guidelines. So that's going to be bigger than what is currently allowed under the code, but it's still going to have to meet the guidelines, which means it can't exceed the existing footprint. Like, you can't double the existing footprint of the house. It's got to be subordinate in roof form, and I'll explain what that means. Front yard landscaping and fencing, these type of things that are minor in nature, don't really impact historic materials or historic buildings, and are really just kind of side elements, with the understanding that we're adopting new policy guides that are going to decide the decision making. So we're not going to approve any fence. It's got to be a fence that meets the guidelines and is appropriate in the context. Approval of a site plan tied to zoning. And so there is a process that we could have an entire 1 hour meeting about related to rezoning and how the Hcrc is involved with those. But essentially, it would be delegating approval of a site plan to staff so that we can help inform the zoning process. And I'll explain more about that when we get to the last section of tonight for multifamily infill. Fenestration modifications, so changing windows based on documentation or window patterns that are appropriate for the design of the house or style of the house, adding doors where appropriate. On non-primary facades, those things would be eligible for administrative approval. And Also, finding of historic significance. So there might be cases where a finding of significance, or excuse me, where staff has reviewed a property for eligibility and we've drafted a statement of significance that illustrates how it meets the criteria for eligibility. Potentially, depending on the circumstances, that would allow it to move forward in the landmark designation process with just the staff recommendation for the eligibility. Mostly because we think that some could just go straight to council for resolution if there's not support. But really, it's meant to kind of streamline the process for things that are clearly eligible, clearly meet their criteria, and just needs to move forward in the process. So additions, this is kind of an example of what we're looking at. So the one on the left, you can see it's got a subordinate roof form. It's got like a very clear connection between the old and new. It's got a form overall and materials overall that are consistent with the house. So this one meets the guidelines, would now be eligible for administrative approval. On the right, you see one that would likely be referred to the Hcrc. It has a roof form that is higher than the original form. It introduces a different kind of window pattern, different kind of material. And so this one would not be eligible for administrative approval because it's not consistent with the guidelines. And so they're similar in size, but that's not really what is going to be the determining factor. It's going to be about consistency with the guidelines. So related, and I'll show you actually, I'll pull it up now. On our website, y'all can all see the website, I think, Warren. Okay. So when you go to our homepage, this is going to be the first thing you see. If you click on this, this is where all the public meeting information is. If you go to documents and resources, you'll see these draft policy guides, and they're PDFs. You can download them. A few of you actually have printed copies of them. These are in draft form, but they are very consistent with our current guidelines. They're just going to provide more guidance. And so our current guidelines don't really define what we're talking about when we talk about our front fence and where it should go and where gates should be, where it's appropriate to have privacy fences. So this is more illustrated and more explanatory of what the expectations are for these types of applications. Something is missing here. I don't know why I didn't load, but there's examples for fence designs and materials that are consistent with the style of the house or the neighborhood. And so there's a little more guidance in place about what that means too. And this is all consistent with really 5 or 6 years worth of Hcrc decisions. And that's kind of why we're comfortable putting it here. And this is all meant to be a guide for the public in designing their applications for review by staff. So as you can see, we have draft policy guides for fences, front porches, replacement materials. There's one for sustainability, which covers a few areas. That's a really actually great guide for anyone. Xeriscaping and landscaping, as well as we have an existing Windows guide. This is a proposed update just to provide a little more clarity because there's still confusion routinely at Hcrc about what the guidelines for Windows say. Let me go back. Sorry. Switch this. That started me over. Okay. I will not exit the presentation mode again. Okay, policy documents. We have a few questions. So Ricky asks, you need to explain the COA for historic significance and what information would OHP use? Yeah. And so this would be the, I'm sorry. We're talking about the last bullet on this page, finding of historic significance. And we spoke a little bit about this in the section for the landmark designation process. And so this is not landmark designation. This is the first step that is done to determine eligibility of a site for designation. And so there's very clear criteria in the UDC that have to be met in order for a property to be considered eligible for designation. Our staff applies those criteria on a daily basis. There's a process by which anyone can also request a historic assessment of a property where we evaluate properties under those criteria. And we have dozens and dozens that have been done by our Scout SA team led by Jenny Hay, who I think is on the call. I'm not going to put her on the spot because I told her she didn't have to present tonight. But the point is that in some cases, it might make sense where there's clear definition on the significance of the property, where we can clearly apply several criteria that indicate eligibility, that potentially it could move forward in the process without having to have the initial hearing for eligibility. And that wouldn't be every case. Like if there was something contentious or something that was being challenged by a property owner, we would always provide an option for a public hearing. But in some cases where the property owner, like we're working with them and they just prefer that they get a council resolution, then it might make sense to expedite those in very clear cases. Not every case, but in places where something has met several of the criteria for designation. Monica asks, how are neighborhood-specific guidelines intended to coordinate with the new policy docs? Okay, so a couple things. The policy docs would be applied citywide. If there are neighborhood-specific guidelines, which currently there's not really for residential context, River Road is developing theirs currently. We have a couple of other historic districts, commercial institutional districts that have guidelines in place. Mission Historic District, for example, also. Nothing in the policy documents is competing with those or conflicting with those. And it's always envisioned that the district or neighborhood level guidelines would be more specific and potentially more stringent than the citywide provisions. And that's really because all of our historic districts are unique. They might have special characteristics or unique circumstances that would further guide decision-making that could be adopted by the Hcrc and council to guide decision-making. That's not really what these are intended to do. The policy guides are really intended to provide additional clarification for the citywide provisions. So it's not introducing new rules necessarily. It's adding more language that is consistent with the rules we have in place. So there's better clarity and predictability in what to expect in the review. Does that make sense? You're nodding, so I think it does. The admin process for designation would only be for owner supported. Not necessarily. Even in those owner supported cases, we believe it might make sense to have the Hcrc recommend to the zoning commission because that's really kind of the only time that the Hcrc would see it. It would really be those cases where, because of the circumstances or because of the coordination with the owner who might not be in support, to eliminate double hearings. And so if something, let me go back to my flow chart. Jenny made it, it's not mine. So, I mean, a few years ago, there really wasn't this distinction between the two processes. And so there wasn't this double hearing that was happening at the Hcrc twice. And so in some cases, where very clearly something is eligible, especially if it was something that was prompted by staff in our review of a demolition permit, and working with the owner, they want a decision. They don't want it to be drug out for 90 days, 180 days. They just want to know. And so in those cases, it might make sense to refer them directly to council for resolution. The Hcrc would still weigh in if that resolution was approved for designation. That would happen here. Let's see what else. But it would potentially streamline it a little bit so there wasn't this extra step of an initial Hcrc hearing and then another one. Okay. I have another question. Let me get back to where I was so I'm not lost. Okay. Marlene asked, my neighbor was given approval for 4 Pella windows and they put in 9. What does OHP do? Yeah, so that would be considered work outside of scope. And so it's potentially a violation. In those cases, if we get a report like that, we would perform an investigation and take photos of the property, document the site, see what work has occurred. If additional approval is needed, then we reconcile that. If it's something that's eligible for administrative approval, then we approve it. If it's something that requires additional approval by the Hcrc, then we create a case that goes to the Hcrc. It is up to the property owner to complete and submit the application to do that. If they don't submit the application, then we have remedies in the code for enforcement, which include municipal court and all of those things that the city can do. Bianca has a concern regarding fences. Many properties within a historic district lack ample setbacks for fence installation. Example, a driveway is on the property line, and if the adjacent neighbor installs a fence, then the driveway is no longer functional. Yeah, all of those kind of micro details that we can't always anticipate, those would be considered. Like, we would require a detailed site plan. We would make sure that nothing is weird, you know. And if you follow staff's recommendations on fences, especially front yard fences, like, we generally don't recommend operable driveway gates and those type of things, and truly just kind of fencing off the front portion of the yard from the house. But again, all historic properties are different, and so there may never be, you know, a one size fits all design. Sometimes if you do that, kind of turn back with the fence to the house, sometimes it ends up landing in the front of the house and it's not going to work. And so every case is treated differently. If there's a solution that is not a clear-cut solution that is consistent with the guidelines, then those would always be referred to the commission. But to add to that, what language may be added to ensure the functionality of the overall site and adjacent site? Yeah, I think in all of those, there's language in all of those draft policy guides that kind of speaks to the process, and that, like, you know, we're not bound to approving anything based on whether or not it looks like the picture. We're going to review each one and make sure it's the most appropriate for the property and in consideration of the guidelines in place, and we'll make a decision accordingly. What it does is just to repeat, is it gives staff the ability to approve them, where now the code literally doesn't give us the ability. And so we would be able to use discretion to take action on those. We'll have to get more specifics, Bianca, and we can talk offline. Okay. Moving on to neighborhood infill. So this is really intended to address a gap in our process. When our historic design guidelines were drafted in 2012, we weren't seeing the same type of development pressure that we're seeing now. And honestly, they were drafted with kind of single family projects in mind. And so what we're mostly seeing in our historic districts is something a little more than that. And in many cases, the underlying zoning of those residential areas allows for something more than a single family. So we do have multifamily zoning in our historic districts where more than one unit are allowed. And sometimes that results in more than one building, and our guidelines really aren't sufficient for addressing those. So we worked pretty extensively with a group, and we actually spent a little bit of money on this to engage professional services to develop the worksheets that we're going to show you by screenshot here in a little bit. But here's kind of a summary of the recommendations: is to create new worksheets and a guide for the review of these type of instances, multifamily infill in a historic district. Mostly expecting things that are 3 or 4 units on a site that traditionally has had 1 or 2 things. And so, you know, upping the scale a little bit in a way that is appropriate and consistent with the historic development pattern. That includes updating the application requirements to include the completion of those worksheets. We are also proposing amendments to our citywide historic design guidelines to include a new section specific to multifamily infill, and we'll show you some screenshots of that. And then all of this is meant to reinforce some processes we have in place. IB means informational bulletin, but basically it's information that we share with applicants in the IDZ zoning process for coordinating those projects with OHP and the Hcrc as they're going through the zoning process. And so this is what those worksheets look like. And the purpose here, and why you see that red dashed line, is it's really about defining the context under which your request will be evaluated. And so very often somebody will come in, they want to build a 2-story house on a lot that has only 1-story houses. And they'll say, well, hey, look, there's a 2-story house in this historic district. It's just 4 blocks away. And so we're really defining what it means to, like when you're citing neighborhood context, what that means. And it's really about looking at the most immediate lots. And so there's sort of a formula in place for calculating that. And now, as proposed as part of your application, you'll be showing us what is in your immediate context through this report sheet. And then we also talked about updates to the historic design guidelines. And so this is also on that same website I showed you. And so we're providing more examples of kind of what is, in an illustrated way, what is found to meet the guidelines, what type of building forms respond to the development pattern, what type of lot coverage and building footprints and parking configurations are consistent with the guidelines. And so these illustrations kind of do that. This is another area where we're providing guidance for how to reduce the visual impact of building scale as viewed from the site. So it's not actually saying the house can be a certain number of feet in the air. It's saying here are some strategies you can incorporate in your design to reduce the impression of scale. And these are things that we've talked about at the full hearings at the Hcrc. They're on the record, and sometimes these are included in stipulations with approvals. But you can see, like, it is possible to do pretty dense projects in a sensitive way. It really comes down to the design and how skillful that designer is and responding to the guidelines and responding to the immediate development context and coming up with a solution that is visually appropriate. And so there's some strategies that are included here. And then this isn't really something that is proposed as a UDC amendment, but just kind of explaining the issue. A few years ago, there was a change in the rules for IDZ zoning requests, where a detailed site plan is sometimes required for certain IDZ requests. And so generally at the neighborhood level, residential infill level, that detailed site plan is going to be required. And a historic district, it raises a concern because that detailed site plan is now moving forward along with the zoning of the property and is approved by ordinance with city council. And so that site plan is really kind of adopted by ordinance in a certain way. And so we want to make sure that as those decisions are made, that there's at least, it's at least within the context of the fact that this is subject to review at the Hcrc. And Lauren, who I mentioned earlier, one of her jobs as a management analyst for the department is to coordinate agendas with other bodies. And so she's reviewing all these zoning agendas, and we're providing comments. We're reaching out to applicants in zoning cases, and we're coordinating comments and feedback with the zoning case managers. And so very often what will happen if somebody is starting the zoning process in a historic district, they know to meet with us or they know to meet with the Hcrc. Sometimes they do opt to come to the Hcrc with conceptual review of a site plan to inform the rezoning process, generally because they learned the wrong way or learned the bad way. That's an important step to take. But sometimes they're also just seeking a recommendation from staff, and sometimes it's more clear than other times. Again, no two cases are the same. And so we're always going to be providing comments and recommendations for those zoning cases. And ideally, if it's something that's more complicated, it's coming with a recommendation from the Hcrc. And so what is sometimes happening is a site plan alone is coming to the Hcrc for recommendation. And often what happens is the Hcrc just has more questions. So sometimes that develops into a full-scale kind of conceptual schematic level review, where there's some modeling, there's some material specifications, there's more of a high development. But sometimes it is just a site plan. And in those site plan situations, it's potentially a recommendation from the city staff to the zoning commission. If it happens that by ordinance, a certain site plan is adopted with the zoning or tied to the zoning, there's always, that doesn't take away the requirement for Hcrc to approve the permits. And so, ideally for the applicant, their design as it's developed is going to remain consistent with that site plan and not have to change too much. But if it is inconsistent with the guidelines, they might have to change it, and that could result in another requirement to rezone the property. So with that in mind, most people are opting to take the right kind of precautions at the early end of the process, and at least seeking feedback from OHP and the Hcrc. This is not something that we've had a big problem with in the past couple of years. It was initially a problem right when the IDZ rule changes occurred, but in coordinating with DSD and the zoning team, I think we've had pretty good results, and most people know what to expect and navigating both of those reviews. Monica asked, when I say multifamily, am I referring to the type of redevelopment as zoned, or am I considering multiple, say 3 to 4 dwellings? Yes. So we're really trying to fill that gap where, you know, I feel like we know how to deal with something that is clearly large scale multifamily, what most people would consider an apartment complex. But when you think about, like, when you actually look at our historic neighborhoods, there is historic precedent for multifamily. We see duplexes, we see fourplexes, we see accessory dwelling units, back houses, over garage apartments. Like, that stuff has been there this whole time and is appropriate in many cases. Like, it is what we view to be an appropriate way to add density within a established neighborhood. And so this is really meant to provide new guidance for those projects that are kind of like the 3 to 4 new unit range, kind of small to medium density infill, that are multifamily in nature, but are really kind of not accounted for in our existing guidelines. Okay, any more questions about this? Okay, there's a few more things. We already talked about this, but just a summary, like we do this all the time with UDC amendments, is if there's any state legislative updates that we're required to codify, and we do those. And so there will be changes related to the designation process because of the new state rules. So this is going to come to a surprise as to many people. It actually came to a surprise to us in September, just a few months ago. But there was a bill that passed that takes away the municipality's ability to regulate the installation of solar devices, which is a solar panel. There are exemptions for HOAs because that's a private contract, but as far as city requirements or city permit requirements, we can no longer regulate installation of solar. That includes historic districts. So before doing anything, like we talked to other cities, we talked to the city attorney's office, we made sure that our interpretation was correct. It's unanimous that this legislation does not allow us to issue certificates of appropriateness for solar panels anymore. It's not a very common request. I mean, we do see them at Hcrc from time to time, and obviously our existing guidelines do have provisions for solar panels. I wrote down 2, I think there's been 3 maybe since September that came in for a COA for a permit. And we've had to waive those reviews as a result of this state legislation. So I think that this is probably news to a lot of people. There was probably a solid 30 days after September 1st where we weren't sure of the interpretation. And so we've kind of held off on waiving anything since then. But through those discussions, we're pretty confident that this legislation takes away our ability to regulate solar panels. What we do, though, is we are still going to provide best practice recommendations to those installers. So, following the guidelines, like we do have recommendations for placement that makes sense, I think, in many cases. And so we'll continue to provide those recommendations moving forward. But again, we can no longer require any sort of configuration, or certainly we can't deny any solar installation. I expected more questions on that. Other kind of housekeeping things, when we do release the draft amendments from OHP, there's going to be quite a bit of strike through and new language, but really what is happening is we're moving things around. When you put everything in the UDC update format, it just kind of looks like more is happening than it is. So what is happening is a summary of everything we talked about. We are moving a lot of things from Article 4 to Article 6, which doesn't mean much to anybody, but you'll see that in the proposed amendment language. We're eliminating out-of-date references. There's a lot of references to departments or city positions that no longer exist, and so we're actually proposing more general language that we think will have more longevity. We're looking through our Appendix A, which is the definitions. And so definitions are really important in the interpretation of the code. And so we're looking at making sure that those are all kind of up to date and tight and defensible. And then Appendix B is where the application requirements are. So that's getting quite a bit of an overhaul as well because of everything we talked about, making sure that applications are meeting all the requirements for review, and that as we make decisions about completeness, that it's defensible and makes sense. Bianca, I do not know why there would be a VOA case for solar panels. That's news to me. NCD and historic district guidelines treated differently, not in the case of that legislation we talked about. The legislation is pretty sweeping, so the city, under any sort of mechanism, can no longer regulate the installations. So it's regardless of overlay district. It would only be through private contract like an HOA. So again, this was really meant to be a refresher. Like none of this should have been new information except for that last slide on solar, because that is something that happened sort of more recently. We hope to kind of release the amendments within the next few weeks, hopefully make them available for public comment. The plan is to have another meeting like this, another couple of meetings, but really what you see on the screen, December 2nd and December 4th would be similar content, but we wanted to provide an in-person option. A lot of people just kind of learn and participate better in person. And so there's going to be another series of meetings after the Thanksgiving holiday. Thursday, December 2nd would be the similar format, but then we're also providing a Saturday morning option in person at the Tri-Point on St. Mary's. And so that meeting information will be shared through the same mechanisms that you receive this information. Again, the website, which we talked about, this is the icon you're looking for, proposed UDC amendments. All of this information is there. We recorded this session, and so this will be linked to that page as well. This is where you go to see the draft policy guides, as well as the proposed updates to the infill design guidelines as well. Yeah, so there was a question about administrative approval. We talked about notification to historic districts, so where does that stand? That is related to the Explorer map, and let's just quickly get into that. 7 o'clock, but I do think we have briefly amount of time for that. What is proposed specifically? And let me actually go back to this slide. Sorry, I'm just looking for it. Oh no, I'm sorry. We're kind of proposing two things. So typically, as I mentioned, administrative approvals are potentially like a same or next day turnaround, so it's going to be pretty quick, unless it's referred to Hcrc. With the expansion of the administrative approval list, we're actually proposing that anything that is currently in the UDC as eligible for administrative approval would still be kind of the similar timeline, but the new proposed changes, these kind of bigger things, would be held essentially for the full 10-day completeness review period. And so we wouldn't do like a same day decision on those items. We would basically hold it for 10 days. And if it's consistent with the guidelines and consistent with everything in place, we would issue the approval following that 10 days. And so that's meant to give neighborhoods notice of the application so that they know it's happening. We haven't quite determined like what that looks like. That's really more of a policy decision, you know, if that's, and potentially there's like a technology solution too, if like there's a way to subscribe for updates to see what's happening in your neighborhood specifically. But right now, kind of what's envisioned is that people would be able to utilize this Explorer map. And what you can do is, as cases come to us electronically, they're automatically accessible via this map, so the public can access anything that we can access for the most part. And if I turn on under review, you can see these little pink boxes are added. That's anything that we have an application for that hasn't been processed yet. And so it's pending an action. And so that's going to include something that's scheduled for Hcrc. And it's also going to include something that has been submitted that might be eligible for administrative approval after a certain amount of time. This one needs to be resolved and closed out. But another thing you can do is search by your historic district. Request status,
in progress. Let's just pick a different district for fun. We'll go to Monte Vista. It's going to take me to that district specifically and more clearly show me where all of these pending reviews are. And so you'll be able to access each of those, go to case info and see what's been submitted. And so this one's in progress. I don't know why this hasn't been issued yet, but you can click on each of these and view the application materials. See if it works. Yeah. And so in theory, there might be some sort of notification where you would know to go and look for these, but this would be the place where you would go to download materials and look at what's happening in properties near you. Any other questions about anything tonight, or questions that you would like us to address at a future meeting? Okay, well, if not, thank you all for your time. We appreciate everyone's participation in this. As things develop further, you'll receive additional updates, and we welcome your participation moving forward. So everyone have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Corey.